Welcome everybody to this, our third edition of the Workplace Evolution webinars. When we were planning this webinar and we decided on maximising employee cost efficiency as our theme, little did I suspect that just a month ago, Rachel Reeves would be standing up to deliver a budget with employer cost raises at its heart to plug the black hole in public finances. Three key themes emerged for me at that point, and we've echoed them in our webinar today. Now, the first is around increased employment costs. Now, that's not only the headline-grabbing employers' national insurance charge increase, where a rise to 15%, together with a reduction in the secondary threshold to £5,000 per annum, it's going to mean an increase for an average employee who the ONS says earns between £32,000 and £35,000. The net cost for them will go up by £1,000 on average for the average employee. Now that adds up really, really quickly. And as a further blow to employers, we've got significant national minimum wage increases, which are announced following recommendations from the Low Pay Commission. Now, we're going to send you a recording of a webinar that we did with the LPC, which was helping to frame their thoughts and recommendations. So some of you may find that of interest. So if you would like to have a copy of that webinar to watch a recording, please do pop a request in the Q&A box. And whilst I'm talking about the Q&A box, please could you also use that for any questions that you might have for today's panelists? And because we're recording this session, we'll be answering the questions at the end, unless I see something particularly interesting, in which case I will interrupt our speaker. Now, Siobhan Waters, who leads our NMW practice for London and the South, will tell you a little bit more about the NMW issues in a moment. But if, Aaron, we could turn to the agenda, I'll just talk through what else we will be covering today. So this first theme, as I said, was increased employer cost, and Siobhan's going to be talking about NMW. The second theme highlighted the tightening up of controls around employment tax compliance, with changes to umbrella companies, introduction of new bodies, etc. And I'm not going to give everything away, but Lewis Howarth, who heads our governance practice, will be covering the importance of compliance and governance for employee tax risk. And that will then lead into Jaz Buewa, who is a director in our digital team, who's going to be talking about the detail of governance and controls for your payroll system. So that's going to fit really well, I hope, and give you some really important information. And then finally, last but by no means least, when there is so much pressure on employment spend, it's really vital that you maximise bang for your buck. So make sure that every penny you spend is not only not wasted on penalties, not wasted on interest, money that you have to spend by reasons of legislation, but also something that your employees are going to value. And Melissa Bruno, who's a partner in our People Advisory Services team, is going to talk about what employees really value. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Siobhan to talk about national minimum wage. Oh, there's a list of our speakers with their pictures so you can identify us.
Thanks, Caroline. So yeah, today I am going to cover the broader implications of the national minimum wage rate increases, as well as some key considerations when it comes to national minimum wage compliance. Can I have the next slide, please? So the increase rates effective from April 2025 have now been announced, and in a similar vein to previous years, there's been some significant increases across the various rates. So the national living wage increase for over 21s and the national minimum wage brackets underneath that. Now, the broader impact on those rate rises is if you look at the percentage increases, for those staff members who are not paid at national minimum wage, they're unlikely to see a 6.7% increase in their wage, never mind an 18% increase in their wage. And the impact that we have seen over the last few years with the wage increases has been a resulting pay compression across pay scales, across businesses. And that is something that also has a wider implication for recruitment, for attracting new talent, for retention of existing staff members, and for progression, because as we have seen higher increases to the minimum rates, those that are in a more supervisory or experienced role not getting the same reflective pay increases has a gap there that is less than it used to be. Caroline touched on the increase in national insurance contributions as well. So coupled with the national minimum wage increases, Many employers out there are looking to maximise the efficiency and looking at their overall staff cost. Whilst they're not able to give a higher percentage increases, they might be looking at their overall reward and benefit package to incentivise their staff, keeping that recruitment and retention piece in mind as well. The difficulty there, though, is that a lot of these reward and benefit incentives can have a knock-on effect to national minimum wage and ultimately can have an inadvertent breach resulting through thinking you are doing something that's going to help your workers and it has the opposite effect. If there are any failings against national minimum wage, it is far more costly in the long run. And I'll give you a few examples of that. If you do underpay someone £1 this year, and you have to correct that after the 1st of April 2025, you would have to pay the underpayment of the pound back reflective of the rate in the year it's being paid back. So that pound now costs you £1.67. If you find yourself being part of a HMRC inquiry where that figure has been identified, they will also look at extrapolating across the previous 6 years, as well as current and ex-workers being in scope to have any underpayments repaid back to them. They would also apply a 200% penalty, so the underpayment of £1 therefore has a penalty of £2. So you're looking at £3.67 for a £1 underpayment. The other impact of an HMRC inquiry is a reputational impact. You may well have seen that they do publicise a name and shaming list for employers who have failed in their national minimum wage obligations. That list doesn't differentiate between someone who's created an inadvertent error, thinking they were doing something good for their workforce, against someone who is knowingly underpaid. And local press, national press will pick up on these stories, and again, it can have that knock-on effect to recruitment as well. With that in mind, if I can move on to the next slide, and looking at the poll question. So there's a poll question here I'd like you to have a think about and answer. So following the announcement of the new rates, have you identified any changes your business will have to make linked to the increases? So yes, we will have to remove people from salary sacrifice schemes. Yes, we would need to change your overall reward and benefit package. Yes, we may need to reduce some working hours. No, nothing will change apart from rate of pay, or not yet reviewed the impact. I'll give you a couple of minutes to answer on that.
Siobhan, while people are just answering the poll question, can I ask you how active HMRC are at the moment at looking at national minimum wage compliance and trying to seek out errors?
Yeah, so we had notification from HMRC yesterday that they are targeting, as part of a geographical campaign, London, specifically the north and west of London. And that is a programme they have been very successful in across different parts of the country. We do know that they also have some sectors in mind as well. And certainly with the rates increasing come April, we always see a flurry of HMRC activity coming through from worker complaints. And that can be because they feel they haven't had their wage increased as of the 1st of April. But the rules around it being the pay reference period after the 1st of April can often throw people with that. But that's not to say that HMRC wouldn't dismiss that. They would potentially still continue on their inquiry.
Thank you. People need to watch out.
Okay. So yeah, some interesting answers here. So just to touch on a few of the points. Yep, so some salary sacrifice schemes, again, thinking about pay compression. Some people who were previously eligible without any danger to national minimum wage compliance are now no longer suitable to be in salary sacrifice schemes, which again has that knock-on effect into the overall employer saving as well. Looking at reward and benefit package, 14% are having to look at that as well. Reducing on some working hours, again, the cost of these rate rises are fairly significant. Nothing will change apart from the rate of pay, so that's good. You know, obviously there's been some thought in how NMW is impacted by what's currently in place. But the interesting thing here for me on this to pick up on is the 30% have not yet reviewed the impact. So if I can give you a link back to the cost post-April, if there was to be anything that you've not reviewed and it doesn't come out until after next April, the cost is far more significant. So there is scope between now and the beginning of April to have a review of things that could potentially impact your national minimum wage. And I'll touch on a few of them now if we move on to the next slide. So regardless of the rate of pay, compliance to minimum wage is more than that. The age-old question, how can we be underpaying national minimum wage when we pay what the published rates are? And that's because it's just not as simple as sticking to those rates. There are a lot of different factors that come into play to review your overall national minimum wage compliance. A lot of businesses will rely on the payroll software, which will also give indications of any potential issues. But there are a lot of things that sit out with the scope of payroll software, which could have an impact as well. So it goes much further into processes, policies, and documentation as well. There's 5 key areas where you would have to consider, and one of these areas being out of sync could have the knock-on effect. So looking at the 5 key areas, worker type is the first one we look at. That's the foundation of getting everything right. There are 4 work types for national minimum wage, and each of those work types has a different calculation methodology, and that then determines how you identify the effective rate of someone's pay is. Pay frequency. The legislation only allows for a pay reference period to be 31 days. And where I have seen businesses being caught out with this is they like to change a pay date from the traditional end of the month to the mid-month. And the problem with that is it can extend the pay reference period to a 5-week pay reference period, which would sit out of kilter to the legislation. And that is something I have seen HMRC really pick up on and challenge employers as to why they have longer than a calendar month for their pay reference period. Working time's a big thing. Certainly if you have people that are paid at minimum wage, there is no buffer, there's no room for any error. And if someone is working more than the hours that's on a rota or they're contracted for, and that is not being properly captured and calculated as part of their overall pay, then you could find that 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute could have that knock-on effect to reduce someone below the legal rates. A big thing around working time as well is the records that are kept, and that's not just for people who are paid an hourly rate, not just for people that are paid minimum wage. It would extend much further into the workforce, even for those that are paid a much higher salary, and you would deem them to have a sufficient buffer against the minimum wage rates. Elements of pay. So someone's hourly rate may be topped up by allowances, by overtime, by other various incentive pay within the business, and not all of those elements are counted when it comes to calculating minimum wage pay, and failure to incorrectly account for that could mean you enter someone into a benefit scheme, salary sacrifice scheme, identifying that there is a bigger buffer when essentially it comes off the basic pay. And linking back to the worker type, the calculations then determine how these elements of pay are treated as well. And deductions. So the standard deductions that come off people's pay wouldn't have an impact. However, certain deductions will have an impact and reduce their effective rate of pay. A lot of businesses think that it's a good thing to keep the transaction simple and deduct something from someone's wages. Good example I've seen recently is use of a car park. So using a car park that has to be paid for, that's owned by the employer, rather than having them pay daily, it is deducted from their wage, and that would then have a reduction in pay. So whilst that car park may be more beneficial for the worker to use because it could be cheaper, it could be closer, and it just helps them get into their work a bit easier. It's not necessarily the right type of benefit that wouldn't have the knock-on effect to minimum wage. So there's a lot of care around the reward and benefit package, making sure that anything that is looked at, anything that's added on, doesn't then have that knock-on impact and ultimately cost you more money in the long run if HMRC do an active inquiry. And that's my section. Thank you.
Thank you, Siobhan. Let's turn now to Lewis, who's going to talk about risk management.
Great. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Siobhan. So hi there. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about risk management. I'll set the scene a little bit about what we're hearing from businesses around the sorts of risks they're worried about and that they're facing. And then, given I work in tax, I'll bring that down to a tax level, how that plays out there, and the sorts of things that, as a business, you might want to be thinking about to manage those risks effectively. And I'll try and keep the focus around your people and your costs side of things as well. So if you can move to the next slide, please. Perfect. So BDO completed a survey at the beginning of the calendar year. There was 500 C-suite executives sent a survey. All their responses were pulled together, and then we published a global risk landscape report. I've pulled out some of the key results of that survey here. So if I jump to the second bullet point, the number one risk that business leaders felt the most and prepared for was regulatory risk. And what was interesting about that is, compared to the same survey 12 months before, where that ranked 14th at the time, it now ranked number one. Regulatory risk is obviously very broad, but tax is a key part of that, which is what I'll cover shortly. Some of the other things that were touched upon in the report, key findings were there was a 19-point increase in concerns around technological changes and development. So I know lots of businesses grappling with how to evolve with the likes of AI technology at the minute. So kind of touches upon that issue there. And then an 11-point increase in macroeconomic development, like concerns around macroeconomic development. So the interactions between the structures and behaviors and the decision making around the economy as a whole. Now, what's probably quite interesting here, particularly on the regulatory side of things and the macroeconomic developments, is what we found in some of the answers to the survey was there's been a general sense of what we call regulatory paralysis across businesses. So 65% of the businesses were delaying decisions until after the major elections. So a couple of stats behind that. I think there was about 2 billion people going to vote this year across 50 plus countries around the world. So from both an economic and regulatory perspective, there was lots of businesses just holding off making probably key decisions until they had a greater sense of what maybe a new government would bring in. I've got some examples there, but I'll probably cover them on the next slide. But before we jump to that, what I'll do next is, thinking of these three key findings from the survey, just talk about how they may have an impact or pose risk to your people and your costs. So if we could just jump to the next slide, please. Perfect. So I won't go through all the bullet points here, but I'll cover off some of the main ones. So just delving into regulatory risk, from a people perspective, and I'll focus largely on the UK here, but we're seeing improved workers' rights granted to employees. So, for instance, we're seeing more day one right to certain kind of types of leave, like parental leave, given to employees nowadays. And Siobhan's already touched upon greater kind of the national minimum wage rises, and we've also seen the ending of 0-hour contracts. So, from a people perspective, these things create a risk, because if you're operating maybe a 0-hour contracts, then you have to adapt and change, or the national minimum wage rates change. You're going to have to make sure you're able to cope with those changes and track accordingly, as Siobhan's already talked about. And then on the flip side of that, new regulations that we're seeing in the UK in particular increase cost of business. So the cost of doing business is just more. Caroline mentioned at the start, and national insurance, employer national insurance rises. We've already talked about the national minimum wage rises. So just businesses getting more expensive to do. On the technological side, I mentioned AI before, but how AI is going to impact your people as well, and the data that you hold as a business and what data you put into that and where it's housed and where it sits. These are key things that businesses really need to be thinking about. And then linked to people, but the cost associated with that is investing in that technology. But also you've got an existing workforce in place. So what do you do around that existing workforce without getting rid of people, which we don't want to do really, is how do you retrain or can you redeploy those workers? So these are some of the broader things to think about and how the people and the cost agendas interact with one another. And then just on the macroeconomic side, workforces are changing more than ever. And I know Melissa will come on to some of the things that employees really value, but people want to typically work more flexibly than ever before. The age demographic of the workforce is changing, particularly in developed countries, and that leads on to other things like the types of benefits that employees want to be able to get from their employers. So employers are having to think a bit more outside the box than ever before now. And then on the economic aspects from a cost perspective, there's been lots of impacts to costs. We've still dealing with some of the fallout from the pandemic. I know it feels like a while ago now. We've got ongoing global conflicts, inflation, caused by some of these reasons and others. So there's businesses are juggling a whole series of risks here that have various impacts on their people and on their cost base as well. But what I would like to say is that these things also present an opportunity in terms of how your business responds and reacts to these things. And I'll come on to how to respond to some of these risks shortly. But how you respond to them creates an opportunity. And as a business, if you respond in a positive way and in a joined up way, that hopefully presents an opportunity to manage your costs more effectively, but also maybe keep your workforce more engaged and happier. So if we move on a slide, please, I'll just bring this into tax. Now, what you're seeing in the chart, the specific detail isn't particularly too important. But what I wanted to show here is from a tax risk perspective, the expectation on businesses has changed significantly, particularly over the last 20 years. And that has impacts on your cost base and also potentially your employees as well. So where we've gone over the last 20 years in the tax world is we've gone from finish the tax year, reconcile everything and report it to HMRC and settle the taxes due. So it's after the event, you can sit back, think about it, pull everything together within a reasonable time frame and then report to the tax authorities. And this is in the case in the UK to HMRC, but tax officers around the world going through the same journey. But what we're seeing now more than ever, and that journey is continuing, is the move to real-time reporting per transaction or in month, and that requires lots of data to be pulled together in one go, and that requires a joined up approach from lots of different teams. So if I just pick up on one specific example, we've got on the chart there around 2012 RTI, real-time information for payroll purposes. So hopefully most of you on this call are familiar with that. That requires lots of joined up thinking from people in HR, people in payroll, reward, benefits, finance. Lots of stakeholders need to be involved here to manage that reporting and therefore manage the tax risk. And that's evolving further from April 2026, where employers will mandatorily have to report benefits in real time on a monthly basis rather than a year-end process, which has been in place and still is now, but from April 2026 will be removed. So for most benefits anyway. So again, further risks for businesses is how they manage data, how are they joined up, and how do they think about how they report all this information in a compliant way as effectively and efficiently as possible. And just touching on kind of tax risk, the recent budget announced that the government are going to give an extra £1.4 billion to HMRC to invest in new staff and technologies, and that they're expecting to hire an additional 5,000 compliance staff. So What does that mean for businesses? Well, we can expect HMRC to be more proactive around tax risk, using things like data analytics. But also they've got more bodies on the ground now, so they can have more complete more compliance checks and ask more questions of employers. So now more than ever, the expectations and pressure on businesses to get their taxes in order in real time is greater. So if we just move on a slide, I think there's a poll question. Perfect. So we've got a question here. It'd be great to get your answers. Now it's focused on employment taxes because that's my area of expertise. But we just want to try and get a sense of how well equipped you think your organisation is in terms of governance. Now I'll come on to governance on the next slide. What good looks like. But so the options are you have a formal process in place, formal processes, policies and controls, and you've got someone who takes responsibility for employment taxes. Second one is you've got these formal processes, policies and controls, but no one really owns employment taxes. The second two are you've got informal policies and processes, but the reverse in terms of you've got someone dedicated to employment taxes or not. And then the last option is there's an absence of processes, policies and controls. And also there's nobody really owning employment taxes. So if you could just get your answers to those questions, that'd be really helpful. I'll just give you a minute. Hopefully we've got some answers to show on screen. Perfect. There we go. So it's good to see that nobody answered the final option there. But we can see there in about 60% of cases, we've got you've suggested that your business has formally documented processes and policies and controls, which is great. Some cases you've got someone owning employment taxes, someone not, in some cases not. And then we've got the remainder of the answers. There's an absence of anything formally documented, and I'll come on to the next slide now, which will hopefully cover off why that may need to change and why it's so important. So if you can just move to the next slide, please. Perfect. So talked about risk. There's lots of risks out there, particularly from a tax perspective. So how do you manage them risks? Well, from our perspective, it's about having good tax governance in place. And that can involve a number of different things. I think what I would always say is key is, and it's one of the boxes to the red box to the bottom right there is stakeholder consultation, it says there, but just understanding who the key stakeholders are. Now, from my area of tax, employment tax, it's very people heavy. It's not just about the numbers. So we tend to deal with people in HR, reward, finance, payroll. So it's quite broad in that sense. And it's always positive to see when a business has all those stakeholders engaged around employment taxes in some way, shape or form. And that will obviously vary depending on the size and shape and geographical location of your business. But having the key stakeholders engage and knowing who they are is a really key point of getting in a position to have good tax governance in place. Particularly larger organizations might have a tax strategy, generally broader than employment. It is broader than employment tax. It sets the tax strategy across the whole business. But that's maybe something you have in place. What we see a lot is some businesses aren't quite sure where they're at from a tax governance perspective. So there's some maturity modeling to be done there, which is where you're currently at with your stakeholders and processes and policies and controls, and what's the current state of play. And then that hopefully helps inform the conversations that are then held around where do you want to get to as an organization, and how does that track with how you want to grow and the people that you have within the business. And then from all of that, key to tax governance is having policies and processes in place. So when the poll there was about 50% of businesses that didn't really have anything formally documented around those things. And from a tax perspective, it's really key that they are in place. Just to give an example of that, so we're increasingly seeing HMRC issuing new guidance, which is termed guidelines for compliance. So we've had some around VAT recently issued, and then about 12 months ago now, HMRC issued some around the engagement of contractors. And what's key about these guidelines for compliance is that they're very, very prescriptive in what HMRC expect a business to do to manage their compliance within these topics. And it would be remiss of any business not to take a look at them and think, are we doing these things at HMRC? And they will break it down in very specific lists of, are we doing these sorts of things? And HMRC are positive, I guess. They recognize that a large business may need to do more than a medium-sized business in some of their examples, and a smaller business, which is helpful when you're looking at these things. But like I say, they're issuing this sort of guidance now to really say to businesses, look, if we come asking questions, we expect you to have these things in place. And that is all around your governance structure, effectively. Who's involved, what's documented, and then how does that play out in terms of what you report? Now, the diagram on the left is kind of the key point to take away from this is when it comes to tax governance and managing your risk, this isn't a one-time process, it's cyclical. So it's a constantly evolving process. As your business grows, or perhaps as you bring in a new system, say a new accounting system or payroll system, or you acquire a new business into the group, this is a constantly evolving process. So there's this constant review and reflect on what's in place and does that need to change in any way. So tax governance is important. It's not just about avoiding HMRC liabilities, but by hopefully having good governance in place, it allows you to minimize disruption, because you can have some comfort that you are in the right place from a tax perspective, you're managing your risks accordingly, and therefore you don't have any unforeseen costs coming into the business by the way of liabilities, hopefully. So that hopefully you can spend time and money in helping the business grow in the most effective way. So that's everything from me. And I know I'll pass over to Jazz, who will talk about payroll and governance and controls.
Thank you, Lewis. That was really helpful. Lewis talked about the importance of processes and policy and how key it is to have the right governance and controls over these areas. If we please move on to the next slide. When we talk about payroll process, one of the key components is the systems that perform these payroll processing and make payments to the workers. I'll first talk about what do these systems do apart from just processing payroll and paying employees' salary. On your screen, if you see, I've highlighted 3 key buckets where things could go wrong and why it is important to secure the payroll systems. The first one is financial risk and regulatory compliance. Now, payroll systems process large amount of data in terms of who has to be paid what, including their bank account information and all those details. Now, if there is some errors during those processing, the employees may get overpaid or underpaid. Other key element is whoever is in their payroll systems and set up as active employees. Sorry, is anybody able to hear? Having hearing issues.
I think we're okay, Jazz. Go carry on.
Okay,
Thank
cool.
you.
Thank you. So yeah, so the next risk we consider is the payments to ghost employees, the people who are actually not working for the organization, but are on the payroll system and hence getting paid. This is a big area which leads to the payouts to the people who shouldn't get paid, and ultimately financial loss to the organization. The next is whatever payments are made to the employees ultimately have to be reported into your annual accounts and financial statement. And the any errors into it could lead to inaccuracies, which would mean when these accounts are published to the wider stakeholders, they would get incorrect picture of how much your payroll cost is, and ultimately impacting your disclosures in your profit and loss account and how the business is performing. And lastly, not to understate it, but if the employees do not have trust over what are they getting paid, and if they're getting paid at the right time, it would lead to a lot of dissatisfaction among employees and ultimately impacting their morale. On the regulatory compliance, I'll not go into detail around it because Lewis has already touched upon these areas. But the GDPR and data privacy regulation also kick in, whereas if any system information which is relating to employees is not secured or is leaked, that could lead to a lot of not just regulatory, but also loss of brand and reputation as well. The next thing that we talk about is the data security and integrity. These payroll systems store a lot of personal details, including bank accounts. And if these systems are not secured, and we have heard all about it, when there is any cyber attack or the information gets released on the dark web, there is a lot of risk around it, including where people's identities are stolen, and that could lead to big repercussions, not just for the organization but also the people who are working along with it. And then the integrity of other data, which is used for HMRC reporting, for pay information, for the financials. Unless it's secured and we are comfortable with the integrity of information, it could lead to a lot of issues on how the data is being reported. And the last category is the integrations and the availability. Now, we know these payroll systems in most scenario don't work in a siloed environment, but they are connected with your wider landscape where the information has to either go into these systems or has to go out for further reporting, such as HR or your financial systems. And if there are any issues around how the data is talking to those systems, or there is any manual intervention on overrides, that would mean the information flowing in or flowing out is inaccurate, ultimately leading to your financial risk, financial loss, payment, people being not being paid correctly or at the right time. And the last one is the availability. And this is, I would say, one of the most key factors, because if these systems go down for some reason or the another, that could disrupt your entire payroll processing. And we all know what kind of a noise it can make in the system if the people are not paid in time, or if there is a large chunk of employees who are paid not to the right amount that they are expecting. Now, if you move over to the next slide, please. Moving on from risk, the second thing I want to talk about was what are the opportunities that you can gain while having good governance. And it's not just about reducing the risk exposures, the risks that we talk about, but also about how it can actually lead to some savings and efficiencies in the processes, ultimately leading to overall optimized processes in these areas. I'll talk about 4 key buckets. These are people, process, technology, and data. And on the people front, when we have those systems which are secure and there are governance and controls and establishes processes around it, the employee morale and confidence is really goes up, and they can use these systems for doing a lot of self-service, like downloading their pay slips, accessing their information, updating their bank account details, address, etc. by themselves. And that ultimately leads to a reduced effort that the HR and the payroll function have to spend to be able to serve those employees. On the process side, uh, these systems help automate some of these areas, which would mean there is consistency of payroll processing and there is reduced manual intervention, hence reducing the risk of manual override. And ultimately that leads to improved compliance because there's a standard way of running and everything goes through in a streamlined manner. On the technology side, I talk about when these payroll systems are running, most of your manual processes happening through the systems would ultimately lead to automation, reducing the time that has actually to be spent around these. The reports that come out, the payments that make out, they are more streamlined and ultimately leading to the reduction in time that the people have to actually spend to process the payroll. And ultimately, when the data is secured and it's restricted, it gives more confidence on the underlying accuracy of the payroll that's generated and paid. And lastly, on the data side, it's all about securing the data which is there and ultimately leading to a more secure system and securing the sensitive and the personal information that is stored around it, and also the accuracy of information that goes out of these systems to your financial reports and other disclosures. So that's what I wanted to talk about on the payroll. And it's not just about reducing your risks and managing and mitigating them, but also helping you to get more benefits out of it and reducing the cost and the effort that the team have to spend. With this, I will hand it over to Melissa.
Thank you, Jazz. If you could move on to the poll. I think we're going to start with the poll in this session, so thank you. So poll 3 is, what do employees truly value? So A, do they value reward? Do they value B, flexibility? Do they value C, environment? D, skills development and trust? E, trust. What do you think they most value? Just give you a couple of minutes and then I'll go with the presentation. Thank you for that. That is interesting. There are a couple of indicators there that I would probably challenge, but we'll go through the presentation and then we can think about that. But you're absolutely right. It's still always getting the hygiene factors right in reward. But I would argue that skills development slightly wins over flexibility. But we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through the presentation. So thank you for that. So if we could move to the only slide, please, for this session. So, hello, everyone. My name is Melissa Bruno, and I lead our People Advisory Services practice at BDO. And we work with clients in 3 areas. We provide advisory services that address the way people experience their organizations. We have solutions that address how the organization operates to enable employees to do their jobs. And lastly, we work on solutions with clients that span both, which is namely workforce or people strategy, leadership, and then the culture in which they operate. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk briefly on what employees value now and why. And I'm going to divide those insights into 2 areas. Firstly, the license to operate. So what the workforce expects from their employer rather, the things that are no longer a nice to have, but expectations that need to be met. And some of these are newer than others. And there is also one that I've added here, which is actually, I would argue, not necessarily what employees would identify as absolutely critical, but employers increasingly need to. And secondly, I'm going to talk about what employees value. What are the factors that your workforce really value now? Important because these are the ones that means the workforce are more engaged and productive. And ultimately, the things that employees value should also be the things, can also be the things rather, that make the organization itself more productive. So firstly, I'm going to talk about license to operate, those hygiene factors. And if I think the slide has built. Yes, perfect. Thank you very much. So firstly, the hygiene factors. So we're talking about things like nothing new, performance-based pay being a fair reflection of their performance in their role, salary commensurate with the market, and as you can imagine, with the amount of plethora of data available, people are very clued up on what the market is paying, and flexible benefits are now standard expectations. Moving through to development. So we know and we find that there is so much more self-learning where your workforce will seek, as and when needed, from multiple sources, learning themselves. And a majority of employees report that they regularly go to external open sources for learning and self-improvement before they look internally. Now, that can be a lost opportunity because learning within an organization is a way of reinforcing culture, reinforcing expectations. But we are seeing this, that people will naturally go and find their learning elsewhere because often it's easier and they think it's more relevant to them. So what they expect from their employers now is that learning is high quality, up to date, and extremely well curated and specific to their role and their needs. So the role of a training provider for an organization is often a role of almost sort of a cross between knowledge management, curation, and just keep monitoring the market for the latest innovation. Where we are seeing real innovation is where leaders are increasingly able to deliver online learning personally via digital mediums. And this has been an incredible resource for workforces because they're sharing their experiences, their career stories, their learning, which is very human-centered and also gives workers exactly what they need, which is aspiration for the future, how they can develop and the lessons that have been learned. The third thing is a compelling digital strategy. And on the other side, when we talk about what employees actually value, they really value access to those digital tools, digital experimentation, be it via Copilot. They're asking for access to those tools, but really important, and what they expect is a compelling digital strategy. And it's a newer expectation, as you can imagine, but they need to feel confident that their organization is thinking about the implications of technology, how it will affect both the business, but how it will affect them as employees. Excuse me. Next is flexible benefits. It's now absolutely expected from most workforces that flexible benefits that are tailored to what they value has become a hygiene factor. It's not a nice to have, it's a must have. But what I am going to call out is the final one, which is well-being. So this is the one that I mentioned earlier, which is maybe employees don't see it as a hygiene factor, but employers need to think about it as a hygiene factor. The data's stark, and I'm going to use some of the data from the FT Vitality report to illustrate what multiple data sources are telling us. that in the UK, since 2016, there has been a 10% increase in UK workers reporting depression. And the sharpest rise is in the under 30s. We are in the UK experiencing record levels of sickness and unproductive presenteeism. So a well-managed strategy for well-being is critical, and being able to identify what will make the most impact and difference is key. To Siobhan's point, care is key, but also spending your money wisely is really key. And there have been some missteps. Less than 3% of employees take up employer-sponsored mental health offers. This doesn't mean to say that they are not of value, but spending the money wisely means that research into your wellbeing strategy is absolutely key. What we're also seeing is that enhanced wellbeing approaches, usually reserved for the senior echelons of organizations, are now being considered to ensure a productive workforce. So there is demand from employees or questions from employees around things like access to private doctors, access to nutritionists, time within work to go and do exercise. All of these demands are on the increase, and organizations are considering how they can broaden these services to more employee populations to make them as productive as possible. But where we are now in the UK, and I would argue, you know, sort of in Western democracies, where we are in the UK, a newer and very prescient need is for financial health. So we are seeing a real rise in financial education and financial health support. Why? Well, given the link between financial insecurity and both mental and physical health is well proven now, and that economic stress hurts productivity and engagement, employers offering support to employees in financial well-being, we're starting to see the data come through that it's reaping, the organizations are reaping the benefits. So moving to the other side of what employees actually really value and whether that's changed. So, and these are the sort of more implicit things, but I'll give you a couple of examples. So what do they value? And how can what they value drive productivity? And the first is trust. So according to the Edelman Trust Barometer, the global data-led indicator, as people's trust in state and religion declines, they are turning that to their organizations to fill the gap. And the data proves the link between trust and workforce productivity wherever you go. We have data, there's all sorts of data out there. Trusted workforces or trusted organizations, it's higher productivity, it's fewer sick days, it's more engagement, it's less stress, less burnout, more energy at work, and more satisfaction, not only with their working lives, but with their lives. So trust is a significant factor for the workforce and for the employer. And if trust starts with tone from the top, the next factor that employees value and links to productivity is leadership behavior. So for the workforce, leadership and the tone from the top is becoming ever more critical. People are expecting their leaders to be more connected, more visible, as we talked about in terms of the learning, more exemplars of the business. The organizations where leaders inspire followership, hear from their employees, openly give autonomy, who behave ethically, are seeing the positive relationship between this and employee engagement, productivity, and retention. And some examples of BDO itself has recently been working with the Institute of Directors to develop and launch an ethical code of conduct for directors, recognizing the demand from organizations and from the leaders themselves for support in this area. And that IOD ethical code is a codification of ethical standards of behavior and leadership. So I'm going to leave you with a thought, because I know that there'll be lots of questions, I'm sure, for this session. So I'm going to leave you with a thought. What employees value is the stuff that drives productivity. And historically, productivity has often been about fixing the worker and not the workplace. So what I want to sort of posit to you, is it time to move to a more balanced approach? So thanks very much, and I will hand back to Caroline.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Food for thought. Um, I'm going to come straight back to you with a question from myself, actually. And we know how critical it is for business that employees are supported. And there seem to be a lot of ways in which you can support your employees. But if you're an employer, how do you prioritize your focus?
I think it's such a good question, and it really depends on your organization and where your starting point is. But I think prioritization is absolutely key, because you can't do everything, you know. And so I would argue that actually looking at your organization and starting to measure some of the data and monitor some of that data to identify where your pressure points are, and also to then start communicating that data to your leadership, to other departments within HR, to say, right, this is what the data is telling us, so therefore where should we prioritize? So I think it depends where your starting point is. It depends what the data is telling you.
Thank you, Melissa. And that highlights that keyword data. And I think that from the presentations I've heard today, one of my key takeaways is the impact of the huge amounts of data that we now deal with, from
Absolutely.
analysing what employees want through to the risks and reputational risks, as well as cost associated with data security through your payroll. The huge amounts of regulation that have grown exponentially since 2017, which Lewis has highlighted, and the information that is now being looked at really, really closely by the National Minimum Wage team. So that's taking me around in a circle back to Siobhan, who's been looking at national minimum wage compliance. And I know that with the increase in national insurance charges, it's really, really key to make the most of NIC efficient benefits. So we're hearing from a lot of clients who are interested in the way in which money might be put into pensions. So Siobhan, can you talk a little bit about what happens if a staff member wants to put more money into their pension? Does that impact national minimum wage?
Yeah, so if it's a salary sacrifice, they've effectively given up that right to that amount of salary, and therefore their effective minimum wage pay is reduced. And again, that's something that I've had many discussions with employers who have said, well, it's their choice to sacrifice into that. It's their choice to sacrifice more, because they're in a financial position to do so, or they're at a stage of life where they can do so. And the legislation doesn't differentiate between that. It's the employer's responsibility to put the controls in place to make sure that the salary sacrifice is something that's eligible and won't breach minimum wage, but also with longevity of that in mind as well. So when the rate increases or they change an age band, that buffer is not diminished through those rate changes as well.
So basically, somebody can be doing something that the employee wants, is ultimately good for the employee,
Yep.
Means that the employee's package is worth the same in their hands, but can still fall foul of NMW by mistake.
Yeah, certainly with the salary sacrifice option on pensions, yes.
And I think that that's a big takeaway from all of it, from all of our presentations, is that there is now so much more information to manipulate, so much more regulation, and so much more administration that's needed, that it really is very easy to do the very best you can, but still, unfortunately, fall foul of regulation. So Lewis, what are the typical consequences of what might be perceived as poor governance, but might not be intentional, from a tax perspective?
So typically, I mean, the headline part of that is you're more likely to end up with a tax liability that you have to settle, and if you've had poor practices in place for a while, that could add up to a number of tax years. So that number can escalate quite rapidly. But taking the cost aside, it just takes up a lot of time of a business. Lots of different stakeholders have to get involved, and often people aren't. That takes time out of their day job, which is making the business run effectively. So, and also it puts you on HMRC's radar in some way, shape, or form, depending how that issue is uncovered, whether they do or whether you take it voluntarily. So there's the cost impact, but it's just the time, and like I said, with the cost impact, in settling a liability you may owe, that cost has to come from somewhere, right? So what is that taking budget out of? And then how does that impact what you have to then do going forward? And does that impact some costs some other way in the future as well? So yeah, it's time, money, and then kind of just trying to plan around it is really difficult then.
Absolutely. And I think with tens of billions going on employers' costs across the UK as an employing entity in all its separate parts, not wasting that money is so important. As Melissa's given you some great tips on how to spend it effectively. Lewis and Siobhan have talked to you about how to make sure that you're doing that correctly from an NMW or from a governance perspective. And Jazz has given us some really helpful information there on how to keep that data secure and make sure that you are making the most of your payroll from a reducing cost and effort perspective. So thank you so much to all our speakers today. Thank you to our participants. You will all receive a copy of the slides and answers to the questions following the event. Give us a couple of days to get everything formatted correctly. For those who've requested a copy of the Low Pay Commission webinar, we'll send out a link to that as well. And if you have any questions, please do reach out to any of our speakers who are listed below. Their contact details will also be provided in your pack. Thank you. We'll close there.